It has long been known that women of exceptional musical skill contributed to the developments in the musical life of the Italian city of Ferrara in the late 16th century. Their story has, in the past, revolved around Duke Alfonso I of the Este family, a powerful nobleman who used music, among other arts, as a means of displaying his wealth and erudition. Alfonso, the story goes, cultivated a style of singing that was highly virtuosic and compelling for listeners. This style was a secret that he guarded jealously, and this secrecy is perhaps the reason that the ensemble of his course was called Musica Secreta, or secret music. The basic outlines of this story have never really been questioned, until now. Musicologist and performer Laurie Stras has returned to the archives of Ferrara and other cities in Italy, and, in her book Women and Music in 16th Century Ferrara, has presented a new understanding of this formative era in music history that places women at the center of the story. Based on her own experience with her musical ensemble, also called Musica Secreta, as well as archival documents that have never before been read or understood, Strass shows that the ensemble so highly prized by Alfonso I was actually part of a rich culture of women's music making that pervaded the city of Ferrara, at the court, in convents, and in the civic sphere throughout the 16th century.
What I wanted to do was to show that the women were very talented and they were extraordinary because they were so good at what they did, but what they did was not extraordinary. The idea of women performing music in a courtly setting and then actually broader in the city and in convents was not in and of itself extraordinary. What made them extraordinary was that they were extraordinary musicians.
Like the men of the Este court, the women in courtly circles would have learned music from a young age, immersing themselves in studies of singing, instrumental performance, and composition. Throughout their lives, they kept abreast of the latest musical trends from nearby cities, and they also drew on the music of the convents in the city of Ferrara. Strass has shown that Leonora d'Este, who entered a convent at a young age and chose to remain there, went so far as to publish some of her works for women's voices, albeit anonymously. These remarkable pieces, with their intense dissonances, are just one example of the repertoire that the nuns of Ferrara sang. Their performances of the liturgy were open to the public and attracted local audiences as well as visitors from outside Ferrara who had heard of the nuns' remarkable music making.
Women knew how to sing polyphony, and sometimes the polyphony they sang was written expressly with just a single sex ensemble in mind. And that was probably where the nuns, that's probably what the nuns did, and what the nuns were then available, what they could teach to the women outside. But then the women at the court in Ferrara, their job was actually much tougher. Yes, they had to rehearse, but they also had to perform more or less nonstop for anywhere between 4 to 6 hours every day. And if you've ever had a restaurant job, then you'll know just how challenging that is. You've got to be able to pick up a piece of music and find a way of playing it, or not have the music at all and just busk it when someone from the audience says, "Hey, can you play so and so?" So when you think of what these ladies were doing night after night, they had to have lots and lots of different performance techniques at their disposal. So I think they learned from the nuns. They were taken into the convents by the duchesses, and so they had lots of opportunity to share musical knowledge with the nuns who had been singing polyphony, well, for decades. But they also had new experiences coming in from other parts of the country. Now, the convents are something that's a little bit different, because the convents, you can walk into the outer church of a convent and you can hear the nuns singing at any time when they're singing the service. It's completely open. So the convents of Ferrara were known to be almost like a tourist attraction, particularly the convent at San Vito, and the convent at San Bernardino. The Giovanni Maria Artusi calls the nuns at San Vito the finest ensemble in Italy. The nuns are part of the civic magnificence. It's part of the city's image, and also the better the music, the more healthy the convent, the more thriving the convents, the more secure the city's spiritual well-being or civic spiritual well-being is. So it's important to Ferrara and to actually any city that their convent's musical prowess is well known. The one exception is Corpus Domini, is Suor Leonora's convent. Now, there are so few records of the music at Corpus Domini. I think that was also part of Alfonso's jealousy, that music was as private for his family as the Concerto delle Dame was.
The vibrant culture of women's music making at the convents of Ferrara was complemented by women's music making at court. The Concerto di Dame, which emerged in the last 3 decades of the 16th century, was based on a long tradition of music making by the men and women of the Este family, which dated at least as far back as the famous Isabella d'Este, who started her musical training in Ferrara and brought it with her to Mantua upon her marriage.
Now, we know that, and we've known for a very long time, that Isabella d'Este, who was an Este princess, even though she was married and became the Marchioness of Mantua, we know that she was a very gifted and proficient musician. She played lots and lots of different instruments, and she sang, and she took that expertise with her from Ferrara to Mantua and imported music teachers with her, took music teachers with her so that she could carry on her study. And her brother, Alfonso Primo, is reputed to have been, we know he was, a very proficient viol player. And then when Alfonso's children, Ercole II and Leonora, who became Suora Leonora, and Ippolito d'Este, we know all of them had advanced musical training from a very early age. I think the earliest that I have Leonora owning a musical instrument is when she's 7 years old and she's at the convent of Corpus Domini, and she has instruments provided for her. Her brother, both she and her brother Ercole had access to what's called a pietra da contrapunto, which is a slate for composition and for teaching. So it's an erasable tablet where they could learn how to write polyphony. When the story of the Concerto di Dame is told in music histories, it's most frequently told as placing these women in what feminist musicology would call the male gaze. So they are objects for male consumption. We are led to understand that Alfonso II, the Duke of Ferrara, was the the prime mover in the development of the Concerto delle Dame. But in fact, what the Concerto delle Dame are is just a continuation of this entertainment that Princess Anna is providing for the relatives and for the highest echelons of the court way back in the 1530s. What happens with the family is the princesses, who, like noble princesses right the way across the Italian peninsula, they are educated in music, and they're educated in oratory. And this is part of making them into the kind of woman that would be an appropriate consort for a ruling a ruling man. So they and when they're performing, they're not performing their own virtuosity. What they are performing is their family's nobility. Now with the Este, they take it further. Isabella makes it into the manifestation of her virtue as a prince. It becomes an active virtue for her, not a passive virtue. So Leonora, in order to carry on, practicing music and composing music, she's protected by the walls of the convent. She doesn't have to present herself as an active musician. She publishes her music anonymously. She's protected by the walls of the convent. Lucrezia and Leonora, on the other hand, they have this really expert musical education, and they love music just like everyone in their family. They're melomanes. They can't get enough of it. But they become too old to practice it. They're no longer princesses. They are no longer on the marriage market. Come, the 1560s, as they get older and older, it's becoming less and less seemly for them to practice their music. So what they do is they become patrons. And they may practice music privately, but their love of music then becomes vicariously channeled into their ladies of waiting. And their ladies in waiting are teenage girls. Lucrezia Bendidio is 13 years old, just like Anna when she's a child. She's 13 years old, and she's singing as part of Princess Lucrezia's entourage. And these young girls then become like princess substitutes.
In 1570-71, devastating earthquakes hit the city of Ferrara, and the court was forced to take up residence in a makeshift camp outside the city. Entertaining visiting members of the nobility from outside Ferrara became much more complicated. Grand theatrical entertainments and ballets were rendered nearly impossible. As Strass shows, the women of the court stepped in to fill this gap. After performances by the instrumental Concerto Grande, the ladies-in-waiting of the court performed as the Concerto delle Dame, the consort of women, and this was followed by dancing. This form of entertainment lasted for decades. The fame of the concerto spread, but Alfonso insisted that the secrets of their repertoire, including the music written for them by the famed composer Luzzasco, be kept secret.
Alfonso's first diplomatic test came in August 1571, when he was obliged to entertain his nephews, the princes of Bavaria, at a camp at Brescello, a garrison border town on the Po River.
And what he had done in the past, in Ferrara, the way that you entertained visiting dignitaries was to have a great big torneo, a great big tournament in Ferrara that involved music and fireworks and military kind of military ballets, horse ballets, and theater, and all sorts of kind of spectacular stuff. He can't do that. So what he does is he orders his sisters and his wives, ladies in waiting, to come to Brescello and provide the entertainment. There were two consequences of this. One was it was incredibly successful, and Alfonso thought, you know what? This is the way it's going to be. I can't afford to put on these great big military horse ballet tournaments in Ferrara anymore. This is cheap, but it's extraordinary. It's unique. And so I'm going to keep this as my format. And he does. He does for the next 26 years. That's exactly the format of court entertainments for visiting dignitaries. The big concerto, the Concerto Grande, then the Concerto delle Dame, and dancing.
Laurie Stras's new account of women and music in 16th century Ferrara required a thorough reassessment of manuscripts and other primary sources that had been known for over a century, as well as the rediscovery of material that had not been read since the end of the 16th century.
In 2009, I went to Ferrara to just tie up a few final ends, and I found that there were documents that had been transcribed or had been transcribed partially, and the mentions of the nuns in the convents were in the spaces that had been edited out. So you might see a document translated, and you'd have some text, and then a ... and then the text carrying on, and the ... contain the stuff about the nuns.
Even the scant musical sources that survived from the Concerto di Dame were incomplete. Foremost among these was the famous 1601 publication of madrigals for 1, 2, and 3 voices by Luzzasco.
It is very clear that the format that Lutsaski had for his own performance with the ladies is not the format that is published in the very famous and the sole source that we have that purports to be the music that the concerto sang, which is Lutsaski's 1601 publication, the Madrigali a uno e due tre soprani, the madrigals for 1, 2, and 3 sopranos, that has a keyboard part underneath and these highly decorated vocal parts over the top. So Lutsaski and the women were singing from basically from a bass part with vocal parts over the top. We don't know whether the bass part was figured, but it certainly wasn't a keyboard intabulation. So when I found that, I just thought, okay, everything I thought about these women is true, and everything that we've written about them has got to be, we've got to think about them in different ways. How I hope people read my book is that they will look at this as a springboard for further research, because there is so much more to say about music in Ferrara, and I left out so much in order to make it into a publishable 125,000 word book. But what I think its value is it brings the stories of the women together, and then it also helps us understand the history of a kind of long-term history of music that has women at the center of the story rather than on the periphery or just stuck into a little box, and the flow of the narrative going around the box. The women are integral players. They are patrons, they are composers, they are musicians, they are part of the audience, and they are actors. They have a real influence on the way the music is written, on the way the music is distributed or not. And so I'm hoping that in itself is a departure, and that people can think about the ways we tell music history, and that there are different ways of telling music history, and that women are not just incidental, that princesses don't just play the harpsichord a little bit. They are there as movers and shakers, and they are decision makers in the way that music is made at court. They are making music at court, and in the convents even more so. They have even more say in what goes on in the convents.